Good evening, folks. Happy Wednesday. Good evening, folks. We're not about to get that double loop. No, 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 no. Welcome to the DM's Lounge. Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up here on a Wednesday night. I'm sure some of you may have better things to do. Sorry, I just received a message from my dad. A lot of my inspiration for even starting to be into D&D and to learn how to tell stories. Just as we're getting started, I've got a few housekeeping things here to cover before we really get into the meat and potatoes of tonight's plan and tonight's episode. I have. Do you have a baby? The fanfare for the DM. I appreciate it. Jesus. Well, just a couple things to go over before we get into the meat and potatoes of tonight's episode. One, well, that's fantastic. I read about your. I'm getting super easily distracted. I know. I'm so sorry. I'm glad you. I'm glad you passed your final. I'm so proud of you. I believe I read about that this morning, and I'm glad you're going to keep going and doing great things. Do you have any more finals coming up, or is that the last of them, the final, if you will? Which is actually appropriate because one of the big themes of the evening is encounters. Most specifically, so it is the big boss, which is appropriate for the night because our theme that we're going to be working with is encounters, one of which, very specifically, is boss battles. No cults. No more cults. We're good. So anyways, the other housekeeping things. Some of you may have noticed down in the description here, we now have the DM's Lounge. I am going to be moving this into a bi-weekly series that runs opposite of the Chronicles of the Chaotic D&D sessions. I'm intending to keep these pretty much aimed at DMs and players, mostly towards newer and less experienced DMs to give them some ideas of things that they can do and at least how I run and look at things. Not specifically to say that my way is not the highway, the end all be all. I'm certainly I'm no Matt Colville. I'm no Matthew Mercer. I've just to give two off the cuff names of other fantastic creators who work in the sphere of D&D as well as other tabletop content creation. But a lot of this is geared towards DMs and players who are looking to try and understand more about how the games work mechanically, narratively, things like that, not necessarily straight from a rulebook perspective. And to that note, I do intend to be able to bring on guests to talk about areas where, when I've talked with them where I found they excel, things that they really enjoy running, excuse me, things like that. So we're going to be working with a wide variety of people, and not, the one thing that I'm very proud of is that these are not all, superstars in the media level people. These are going to be just everyday DMs and players who are going through and talking about their experience with running the game. So with that in mind, with this new series, it's going to be uploaded to YouTube along with the rest of the content from the Chronicles of the Chaotic channel here on Twitch. It will be uploaded onto the YouTube channel of the matching name, Chronicles of the Chaotic. Once I get good at actually doing this and being decent at social media and not complete trash, the link will be in the description with the other social media bits. But you can find us on YouTube at at Chronicles of Chaos specifically. Now that that's out of the way, we get to move into what I actually wanted to talk about tonight, and that is encounters. Now, I know it's an ultra low resolution here on the camera, on my desk cam. I'm not totally sure how to fix that, but we're gonna break this down. I've written up a bit of I don't want to call it an itinerary because it's not really an itinerary, but more just a list of things that I'm gonna cover. Sometimes we might jump around them. We might end up just going down the list, but the topic of encounters varies greatly from person to person and GM and player group. So, as I said earlier, this is just the way I run it. You're going to end up... So the list we mess up with our disturbances. Yes, exactly. The list you mess up with your disturbances. I'm actually going to, now that I know, the channel's working and you can hear me and I can hear you, I'm just going to minimize it so I can't see it and I don't get distracted as much. I'm kidding. I'll still be able to answer your questions and take a moment to look over her every now and then, in which I do highly encourage interacting, asking questions, things like that. And you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait for me to prompt a specific time. Just if you have a question, send it in the chat. I'll grab it. Yes, the list is horribly out of focus, and I wish I knew how to fix that. I wonder. Let me see if I can change the resolution, configure the video. Ooh, yeah, no, okay, ooh. Yay. That's another thing I'm going to be upgrading here in the future, because right now this desk cam is brought to you courtesy of my own physical phone. So yeah, I can't do a whole lot with it. But so, with all that in mind, let's get into the content for the night. So let's start out simple. Encounters. What are they? Encounters are situations where your players will make decisions, some major, some minor, on how they decide to interact with the world. Some of these can be, most commonly combat encounters. Your party gets into a fight with something. Some of these are social encounters where you will have to persuade people, talk, get information, etc. And some of these are environmental encounters. Now, to explain a little bit more about the last one, because it's a little complicated, an environmental encounter can be anything from dealing with a change in weather, to a change in the environment, to working with new people, not necessarily directly, as in not necessarily having a direct conversation with them, but learning to adapt to new cultures, learning how to figure out if you're being watched. Those sort of, I wager to say, more passive elements of interacting with other people. Now, let's start out simply with the one everybody knows and loves. Combat encounters. So, what's so special about combat encounters? Well, aside from it giving the opportunity for your, I don't want to say murder hobo players, but the players who get bored with the talking and want to do more of the stabbing. Hydration brought to you by DM flavored water that's definitely not branded in any way. it gives you the opportunity to create combat, get them the opportunity to flex their muscles, do a lot of breaking up the monotony of travel through running into, suddenly, hey, it's a pack of wolves, it's a goblin camp, blah 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 blah. These are just the way most people do with it is random encounters. You can use the random encounter generator that you can find in the DMG. I personally hate random encounters because to me, the random encounters don't necessarily seem reasonable in most cases, but that's a discussion for another time. The combat encounters that you will run into more often than not are the meat and potatoes of your in-between time for when you're going from point A to point B. What's special about combat? Yes. That was a very good narrative moment, but not necessarily a combat encounter there. That was an environmental encounter, and I'm very glad you brought that up. I will use that as a reference for story later on, when we get to that section. Combat encounters can be your most straightforward and simple. Here's how we're going to buy time and let the GM, exist for a little bit to try and brainstorm what's next because the group is off the walls. They're a great way for your players to flex their muscles, and they're a great opportunity to just shake it up, introduce some creatures of the world, so on and so forth. But that's, pretty much, for all of its versatility, it lacks oomph, real meaning. Sure, you can plug holes, use it to plug holes, but what you see is what you get. At least to me. That is what we end up dealing with. Now, social encounters, on the other hand, I personally truly enjoy social encounters because you can completely change story narrative depending on how you utilize or how you interact with certain social encounters. So there are a number of systems out there that, and I will say this, the Player's Handbook does not really cover social encounters very well. So a number of DMs and players have basically had to improvise and change how they run the social encounters based on their own table groups and how they end up doing things and how they want to do things mechanically. I remember listening to a video from I can't remember the gentleman's name right now, but he creates a fantastic animated series. I think it's Z something or other. He creates a fantastic animated series on YouTube for spells and spells, going over mechanics, things like that. He covered briefly about the social mechanics and how players interact with it, and it was essentially put on a scale, and this scale was made up of 3 smaller scales of how much that character likes you to start and their personality. Is there a difference between player and NPC social encounters? Yes, there is. I actually, that will be covered a little bit later on, but since you asked, I'll cover it immediately after this. The character that you're interacting with it should be a living, breathing entity with their own demeanors, with their own behaviors, how that they interact with people that say things that they do or do not like. I'm going to use a parody of my regular group here, the Chronicles of the Chaotic. For those of you who are not regular viewers, we have two lovely characters. Joyce, who is our rock gnome sorcerer, very charismatic, socially outspoken, happy to speak to everybody. And then we have Grimly, our dwarven bard, who has a bit of a penchant for unintentionally putting their foot in their mouth. So we're going to use those two as my foils for how these circumstances would work. So let's say that Joyce and Grimley are interacting with a certain character, the captain of the guard, for example. For those of you who tuned in last week to the Chronicles of the Chaotic episode, our first episode of the new season, thank you so much. They were speaking with the guard, Captain Renewald. So Joyce decides that he wants to roll a persuasion to try and get some more information out of the guard. He rolls well. He rolls like an 18. Generally successful. Joyce is very charismatic, says all the right things. And then Grimley decides to set in and say something as well. But instead of saying something helpful, they end up rolling very poorly. And it's the equivalent of hot dog toilet water. Something completely nonsensical and kind of detracts from the efforts and energy put into the conversation by Joyce. Now, there are a couple ways that some DMs will do this. Some won't let Grimley roll for anything at all. Like, the interaction was started with Joyce and it will end, or started with Joyce and the captain and it will end with Joyce and the captain. It is an insulated existence of how the world operates. And that is very effective for trying to get, individual relationships and, individual relationships in between characters established and how they want to operate. In addition to that, some DMs will basically go, all right, well, you rolled a nat 20 and you rolled a nat 1, so they're going to basically average out at about a 10. So, while you made a good effort, the fact that your friend here basically, stuck their foot in their mouth kind of detracted from any success that you were going to get. Which, personally, is depending on if the person that they're interacting with would change their opinion based on that, is usually how I roll with it. That's my personal best way to go about it. Usually, some of my groups have learned to just let one person do the talking as the face of the group for one reason or another. But, that how your group will handle your GMing is, so your mileage may vary. And last but not least, there are some who are a little bit more, I will say, cruel in this regard. And they will use, if multiple people engage in this dialogue, they will go by the lowest common, or not lowest common denominator, but basically if everybody's rolling and someone rolls an 18, someone rolls a 12, someone rolls a 9, and someone rolls a 6, they're going to go generally based off of that 6. There are some really cruel GMs out here, and while I'm aware, I would absolutely wear Crying is a Free Action t-shirts, coming soon to the eventual supply store that doesn't exist. And while I may be able to temporarily sustain myself on the tears of my players, that can just be absolutely cruel. So, from there, the question was, is there a difference between players and NPC social encounters? So, I just for clarification, do you mean player and player, or NPC and NPC, or are you just specifically talking about player to NPC? Mm-hmm. Player to player, player to NPC, and NPC to NPC. Okay. Alright, well, we've already covered player to NPC. That can change broadly depending on, how they're interacting, what things are said. If you have one player that decides to sweep them off their feet, and then another that just said, oh yeah, I went and took a dump on your favorite relative's grave. like that'll change dramatically how they interact, and you will have to basically make those decisions on the spot based on your players and what they decide to let leave their face. Player to player interactions, on the other hand, those are very much complicated and nuanced and pretty much entirely out of GM's control. That is the wonderful thing about player interactions. Sometimes you are dealing with players that simply don't have. And this is making an assumption that you have you have players that are actively role playing their character. They're in that acting headspace. They are into figuring out all the nuances of, well, how would my character respond to having someone insult their family legacy. How can one player encourage players to interact with another? That's a good question. But I'll get to that in a bit. But that one is pretty much entirely out of your control. As a DM, your responsibility is for the world and the NPCs. Now, you can provide them with additional information. So, for an example, this was an example of PC to NPC. I had a character call one of my players' characters. It was the barman, Blinky, had called Zircon the Barbarian a rock muncher. Rock muncher is rock muncher for them it's kind of a derogatory term. Not that the character necessarily perceived it immediately as that, but I provided the player with the information like, hey, that's basically, that is not a nice thing to be called. Just to make sure that the player was aware of it. And what they decide to do with that social interaction is entirely up to them. Sometimes you will have players who are just going, oh, okay, I'm going to put that in my back pocket, and then whenever it comes up next, it'll have a completely different reaction than this time. Others will basically go, oh, okay, whatever, and then they will integrate that response into how their character exists. And if that's the kind of player that you're working with that wants to basically they will build their character on the spot. Absolutely, go with it. It's great. Your part of your job as a GM, DM is to provide world information for your players to just make decisions around. All the fancy details over here aside, if you cannot convey critical information from your head to your players for them to act upon, there is a major failure of communication. And that is something that needs to be worked on prior for your experience and your players' experience at the table. But that aside, I will move on to the next question here, which was, how can one encourage players to interact with one another? Honestly, and I say this in full truth, it entirely varies by the group you're with. Some people will go full into the role play. Some of them will absolutely just, oh, well, I'm this character, we're all going to be involved, talk about it, so on and so forth. But the other way, and recently I was listening to a gentleman by the name of Matt Colville. He is a fantastic DM and content creator on YouTube. He has a lot of content for D&D and has run games for years. I really, really love his work. Players will do their own things, and this is my interpretation of it, so bear with me here. Players will do their own things until you make it no longer an option. And I know that sounds very dangerously close to railroading, so let me clarify here. There is a concept in game theory about creating behaviors. It's like every time you look at a red barrel in a video game, your brain goes, that probably explodes. Why is this? It's because this is a behavioral conditioning that people have, that video game players have been basically trained to. So we behave that way more naturally and instinctively for things that are more intuitive, rather than having to sit through there and be told, red barrels explode. Sometimes you're still going to get that for brand new players who have never played picking up a video game in their lifetime. But most of us, we don't even need that. We go, it's a red barrel, it's going to go boom if I shoot it enough times. So what you can do with that is, in the words of Matt Colville, you put them into a corner. Players have a habit of trying to solve all of their problems with the numbers on their character sheets, which I wish I had enough experience prior to that to say that was my idea, but it's not. If they can kill something, they will try and kill it. Like the old phrase, if it bleeds, we can kill it, or if it has HP, we can kill it. You can't kill all your problems. It's very similar to world lore. If you put them in positions where they have to interact with other players, either to solve a problem or to learn more about their backstory because it becomes relevant and you don't want to leave your other players in the dark, or just making those personal arcs matter to more than just the player that's it's kind of revolved around, those are circumstances that you can create and fabricate and manufacture as a GM to try and teach these behaviors. Now, learning how to do it without being heavy-handed and saying, hey, you guys should start talking to one another as a DM to the players is one thing. But using an opportunity and using NPCs and environments and you have so many tools at your disposal as a DM that you can use anything from from an NPC walking up to one of them and go, how well do you really know your friends? To get those gears a turn. It's like, well, I know I've been traveling with them for months, but I really don't know anything about them. Which then sometimes prompts questions of like, hey, did you have a criminal backstory at some point? Did you try to, I don't know, assassinate a local governor? Which I'm sure will prompt many an interesting conversation, depending on, if zones of truth are involved or somebody passes a really good insight check. There are a lot of things that you can do with that aren't necessarily robotic and having you sit down and just go, oh, by the way, here's a thing. You should probably get to know your people better. Does that about answer your question there? And while I wait for his response, the last aspect of the encounters are environmental encounters. Now, earlier I said these are things that aren't necessarily like, oh, hey, here's a puzzle. Sometimes it's learning to adjust to new cultures. It's working with people indirectly. It could be a wide variety of things. And this section of environmental encounters is one that I love very much. Simply because I hate heavy-handed lore dumps. I absolutely hate it. I love player-driven inquiry. I love when players go, well, how does that work? Or what do you mean? Let me go ask such and such an NPC. I love organic questioning and inquiry and when the players interact with the world around them as if it's real. There's something tangible about their I don't know what this is, so I'm gonna go ask somebody, rather than hoping that the DM will sit here and just start, tablespooning lore into their faces in the most boring way possible. And sometimes that's gonna be, while you're traveling, instead of a random encounter with a creature, which sometimes that table just drives me nuts, even if it's non-combat. It's, you come across, as you're walking through this jungle path, you come across this odd standing stone. It catches your eye simply because it is this tall, looming monolith of stone that sticks out in this open circle of cleared area in this dense jungle. It's eye-catching, and there's something, it can't really, it's not like there's anything else around it, but what do you want to do? And, sometimes they will, I want to go investigate the obelisk, which is the best, because then if you want to throw a combat encounter, it's absolutely, because it's something with them interacting with the world. But it also opens the opportunity to go, that's neat, and then they walk right on by it, which is fine. That gives you plenty of opportunities to put, for them to interact with things later on. No asset that you create will ever go truly wasted. It doesn't matter if I build 100 obelisks and they skip 99 and talk to one. The fact that they interacted with and decided to ignore the 99 and only talk to one is still assets and content that were utilized in the world. They just didn't care about it, which is fine. They don't have to. Your players are not obligated to care about every single thing that you do. That said, if you want them to care, this is going back to Matt Colville. In his words, chase them up a tree about it, or chase them up a tree. Put them in situations where they need to use your lore in order to get them to actually pay attention to your lore. That's another thing I forgot to mention in housekeeping, but don't worry, that might be a surprise for our halfway point. Perfect. So there, I will have a surprise for everybody after we come back from our 10-minute break at 8:50. So anyways, carrying on. The important thing is learning how to interact with your players and doing so in a way that feels natural and organic, and providing these tools in a way that is immersive and realistic, and you aren't going to just heavily handed-fisted all of this information in on them. Which takes us to our next section. Creatures. The most abundant form of combat encounter on the planet. I know you can't see it. It's really more of a reference for me. I apologize. I'm going to eventually just find another webcam to kind of suspend over my desk to give you a better desk cam. If I had it my way, I would be able to do this out on the gaming desk, or the gaming table that is at our house here. And that way you could see more of it in a more organic way. But I figure sitting here at my desk where I do my work it's kind of an aesthetic touch. I'll probably just need a different desk. But that's okay. Well, that's all stuff for later on. We're moving on to creatures. Now, let's talk about the concept of a creature. If you want to look at it mechanically, it is a series of numbers that you throw against your players' numbers. Now, if you're a math nerd, that's fantastic. But I'm gonna put this here. Most people don't play D&D for the math. They do things like build trebuchets in their free time and try to solve quantum physics for the memes. But that's beside the point. Instead, what I try to create, and what I highly recommend you guys creating, and it'll sound cliche, but living, breathing creatures. Give them motivations. Like, people think, oh, well, yeah, this is the kind of stuff I do for player characters, PCs, and maybe NPCs if they matter. No. Do that for your creatures. My favorite example is wolves. Everybody knows wolves. I can't list their stat block off the top of my head, but chances are if you're going to go somewhere and play D&D, you're going to run into wolves at least once. I hate using things out of the monster manual because everybody knows what those are. You can throw them into pretty much any circumstance. I'm like, oh, it's generic placeholder wolves. Change that up. Seriously. When I'm running wolves for Elderbane, these kind of wolves behave dramatically differently than what you would just come out in the wild. Comparing to the real world, they behave dramatically differently. And that translates into the mechanics. So, for example, the wolves in D&D for the Monster Manual have something called pack tactics, which gives them advantage when they are next to, when there are at least two wolves next to one another attacking a player. That is meant to simulate their real-world behavior of utilizing pack tactics to bring down prey. When you change their behavior, it changes the mechanics. So the dire wolves and wolves that I work with in Elderbane, they're not pack animals. They're isolated. They're brutal. They're vicious. It changes their entire attack pattern. So there's even combos where if they hit you, like if they hit you with a bite and a scratch and a bite, they'll get an extra attack, and that's just doing a lot of damage. And that's to emulate them. They've taken you down, and they are just starting to maul you. Like, when you bring these mechanical changes that the players will feel in their numbers and their hit points, that, like, if they don't see a difference from how these creatures walk and move and interact with them in their environment, they're going to feel it when it starts hurting their numbers. But your goal should be to get them to understand that there is something inherently different before the numbers start going against one another. That is the apex to me of creating unique creatures. And we're going to cover that again a little later on when we get down to the topic of boss battles. But this is the level of creature and world building that I aspire to maintain on a regular basis for my players. And I truly think that is one of the best forms of creation possible, even if it's more taxing and time consuming. So we go through their behaviors. How do they interact with the world? How do they interact with their environment, especially their environment? And how do those things, how do those behaviors influence how they interact with the player? Are these creatures that have been locked up in a zoo their whole life? Is food scarce right now because there's a famine going on, and because the local crops have died, hunters have been going to find deer and other wildlife, which means the food for the wolves is more scarce. All of these world interactions and behaviors have long-standing consequences. So when you are building, you take those circumstances of the world around them and build that into their mechanics, build that into their behavior. Because I will tell you, it is a night and day difference when you are building encounters that your players will believe versus building encounters to simply test their numbers. So, are there any questions on that section? I know that was a lot, and I kind of came at you at like 120 miles an hour. How about that? But creatures are, they're one of the biggest parts of your world and how people interact with it. Even if you don't do a great job at describing, oh, well, here are the cities, here's, what the nighttime looks like, all these things, creatures will sell the idea. No? Everything's good? Perfect. Okay. So now we're going to move on to basically DM tweaking. DMs can very easily screw up encounters. especially if you're not using everything from the book, because the book does a fantastic job. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying never use the book, because the book is put together by very talented and very well educated people who spent months, if not years, trying to balance everything. That's fantastic and fine. But when you go outside the book, things can happen. For example, I'm still given grief by this. The one time I accidentally killed a PC because I made a mini boss too difficult, and it was a wild boar, and the group had been hunting them for an event, and they passed a couple skill checks, and then they got to the special hunt that would help them win on points, and one of my players, it was I can't remember if they were a warlock or a cleric or a warlock or a cleric. They were a warlock. And they got gored. It was terrible, and I felt bad, and it was a bad time. That was an example of when things go wrong. And there wasn't a whole lot I could do in the aftermath except, save the character's life and just take and incapacitate them off screen rather than, have them keel over on the spot. Because, events, and people aren't supposed to die in these events. Learning how to tweak these encounters on the fly, it takes practice, and you can screw things up. I still screw things up. I say still like I've been doing this for 40 years and blah, blah, blah. But even experienced GMs can and do screw up. There are a number of ways you can fix these sorts of things that aren't just as simple as, oh, well, I'm going to change a couple numbers here. You can do things like having certain creatures retreat. You can have them change their tactics. You can have them, start... You can have them interact with the world, change that, go try and find something to heal themselves. Like, treat them like intelligent entities, if they are intelligent entities. Like, you're not going to find zombies running away, but a wolf, if you hurt it too badly and you don't just, bully circle it to death, it might try and run away. Intelligent creatures with a survival instinct might try and run away. So, tweaking the number of creatures, the big thing that comes to mind for me is tweaking the number of creatures in an encounter. Accidentally drop too many wolves in, maybe some of them leave. They think that this is, the others have got it, and they're going to just wait around until it's their turn to eat at the carcass. Maybe it's, maybe they change into a different form. Maybe, another character shows up. There are a lot of ways to tweak and modify your encounters to change how your players deal with it. And that branches broadly into a number of subjects and topics. Everything from, how do you save your players if they're about to get TPK'd? Or, how do you introduce new characters? And it's a broad and winding subject that you can take in a number of different ways. But learning how to utilize these things in your toolbox for your encounters will open up new plot content. It can open up, the fact that your team, your players don't all die, which is a very complicated thing in and of itself. It gives you options, and it will paint the picture of the world that you are trying to paint. And I guess I pretty much covered all of that, and even with the dice. Most of that, when it comes to player interactions and working with... That's fair. I've never actually, watched and or read Game of Thrones. It's never really appealed to me, though I have seen the Great Bearded Glacier in person. I was at a convention in Arizona with my father, helping him out, and and he was there. I can't believe I'm blanking on the gentleman's name. Oh man, I'm gonna have to look that up, and I'm gonna feel really, really dumb. But that's beside the point. So, are there any other questions before we move on to the last section here before we take our 10-minute break? Yes, no, maybe so. Okay. And I do want to thank everybody who showed up. It's really good to have everyone here interacting. I really appreciate you all being here. So in the last couple of minutes before we go over to, we take our 10-minute break, I want to talk about the environment's role in storytelling. In case you haven't guessed by now, and the fact that I've referenced it like 16 times, I love utilizing the environment. To me, that feels like the least heavy-handed way of providing information for your players, for painting the sort of picture for the world that they're in, for providing them with ambiance and feeling, and just as a storyteller, my goal personally is to enrapture my players in this world where they are, for a time, not sitting around their computers listening to a dude talk, but they are looking and processing and planning as if they were in this bubble that I'm creating around them. That to me is that is the pinnacle, the apex, the best form of storytelling, keeping an enwrapped audience and having them, emotionally invested in thinking and feeling the actual emotions of being there, some of which may be prompted, some of which might not be. It might be their own native, natural things based on what they've been taught before. These are all fantastic things that can be utilized through the environment. And one thing I wanted to mention before, from the perspective of working with NPCs, imperfect narrators are absolutely wonderful, because having them interact with NPCs is one of the best ways to get them information. But the NPCs that they interact with are not guaranteed to have all the information either. Some characters have a reason for knowing things more accurately. Go talk to a scholar, go talk to a sage, talking to an expert in the field. That way you start to instill this understanding from your players. Like, oh, well, I can't just ask any, Joe Schmo. Oh yeah, what do you want to tell me about the scrolls of epic undoing? Like you're not going to walk up to a farmer and get the, oh, well, the scrolls of epic undoing were an artifact of the ancient art list Kubla Khan, blah blah blah. You're not going to get that. Go to a scholar, on the other hand, and all of a sudden they might know a couple things. So utilizing they undo things epically. But there are a lot of extra tools that can help you train these kinds of behaviors in your players that you want them to have, especially for your world. Like for what Elderbane, for those of you who were there for the first session, I had to go through critical core world mechanics in a way that wouldn't immediately kill them, but also introduce the players and the audience to major themes and aspects of the world. Now, not everyone's going to be live streaming it to Twitch, and most certainly not everybody's going to be Um, Sorry, I just gotta. um, I I'm sorry, I completely lost my train of thought, and that's okay. You are not always going to have your party interact with the perfect people, and giving them a reason to invest, chasing them up this tree, putting them in a position where they have to ask your NPCs, where they have to start learning more, where they have to change their behaviors in order to survive. These are the sorts of environmental storytelling pieces that, once you're able to get a good grip on them and master them, you can apply it anywhere. But with that, we've reached 8:50 in the evening. We're gonna go transition to our 10-minute break, and I will see you all when I get back. We'll see you shortly. Hold on. Oh, no. Oh. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Glad we're all here. While I am going to mix things up on this on the fly, I have the absolute pleasure of being able to. Hold on just a moment while I do behind the scenes work. Do. Nathan, why is this capture so large? We're gonna fix that and try and make it reasonable. Oh boy, here we go. It's a chair.
Yeah! Sorry.
Because I'm trying to edit this live and it's not working. Oh boy,
Right.
here we go.
That's such a mess. I believe in you.
I don't. Okay. Hello everyone, welcome back. After small technical difficulties, I have the pleasure of introducing a very good friend of mine who I've worked with only for a brief while, but he and I have gotten very close, and we talk about D&D on a regular basis. This is my friend Nathan Paisley. He is a special guest for the evening just to help us talk about the special content of boss battles for the last hour. Jeff, would you just introduce you? Ooh. Sorry, had some really weird camera stutter there for a minute.
For me?
Yeah, okay, it doesn't show up on stream. That's the important part. All right.
Okay, cool.
Because I want.
I heard your brain stop for a minute. You're like, guys, this is
Oh no! One thing I love about this is I'm glad you guys are able to see it, with real clear-cut audio. It looks like I'm getting maybe 2 frames per second, but going back and forth in time. Oh, it's
my robot dance moves.
Yeah, really. Also, I don't understand what happened with the break screen. I was relatively sure that I changed that from weird. Yeah, no, I was relatively sure I made it. I had duplicated that and changed it so that we'll be back in about 10 minutes. But oh well, the people who are here are here. So thank you everybody who is tuning in now. As I said, we have my wonderful friend Nathan here, who's going to help us cover the last remaining content for the evening. So, boss battles. The big to-do for all major narratives, whether you are fighting a demon-possessed sheep to trying to face off against Vecna. A lot of people get tripped up on bosses simply because it's the big thing. You don't want to have them nerf the players. We're not going to have them nerf the players. You can do that, but
that's a bad plan. I hate it. I'm just kidding.
Generally speaking, that does tend to upset the players a little bit, or a lot of bit. But if you want to make them mad and motivate them, fuck Vecna.
So instead of nerfing anything, I am a big fan of buffing the heck out of everything. I'll take something that's like if my player has something that's really strong, I'll be like, perfect, I made something that is even more buffed, and now you gotta deal with that.
Two of us got nerfed till the end of for what Scout is talking about in chat. Recently we had run a one-shot that has since been labeled Do Goblins Dream of Rainbow Sheep. You can find it on the Chronicles of the Chaotic YouTube channel, Chronicles of Chaos. The entire stream is up there in all its unedited glory if you want to go and see what we're talking about. But the party had been afflicted by a fear spell, and unfortunately, it did not go so well for some of their rolls. So they basically ran the whole way back to town before they passed their saves. So that was unfortunate, but sometimes that happens. You know, the dice gods giveth, and the dice gods taketh away. But we're going to start this out by talking about two kinds of bosses that player salt is important to remember. We'll talk about that later. But static versus dynamic bosses. Now, what I mean by this, and just to provide an example, a static boss is a boss that you will run into in a certain set place. This is your end of the dungeon boss. They don't go out in the world. They don't have any major long-standing plot relevant. Well, they might not. Who knows? They serve as a literary MacGuffin to test your players, whether it's through a puzzle, through a battle, whatever it's supposed to be. This is their milestone MacGuffin of have I done the thing enough? Now, my favorite examples of these are bosses from Legend of Zelda, and I will end up using older references because while I have not played Path of the Wild. Is it Path of the Wild? Or
Breath of the Wild.
Breath of the Wild. Yeah, evidently, as you can see, I really haven't played it.
Yeah, I haven't played it either.
Those bosses are a little bit more dynamic in that they exist on a broader scale, and they have a more significant plot relevance, but they are still relatively static entities. Now, if we're going to compare that to a boss such as Strahd von Zarovich from Curse of Strahd, who is a fan, one of the most well-written villains I have ever seen. He interacts with the players regularly. He is out and about in the world. When you do things, he does things. These are living, breathing bosses that sometimes there is the phrase that sometimes gets thrown around, unscaled world, which basically means, oh yeah, you can absolutely get yourself into a hole that you are not prepared for. And Strahd is one of those, is one such hole. Now, I personally have a deep love for dynamic bosses. Not just because they sound more interesting and yada 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 yada. They play a plot relevance. They're interesting for the NP or for your players to interact with. They have a meaningful existence. But the same can also somewhat be said for static. Now, Naven, I remember from us talking previously, you really love to go out of your way when it comes to boss battles.
I absolutely love boss battles. I'm sorry for interrupting you there, but like,
great. Go for
it. So a little bit of my experience with D&D. So I've played actual D&D for maybe like 2 years, a year or two. But before that, I had a full 100% homebrew game that I made. Right. Completely broken. You could ask my players. It was a really rough system, but the whole concept of it was based off of a manga and anime called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and in it, each boss that the party met, they all had a unique power that nobody else had. So my first D&D, if you want to call it, was literally every single encounter had to be a boss fight. So, and I absolutely love boss battles. So much, in fact, that I find I have a habit of making boss battles even when it should be a normal encounter. But what I like to tell my players is to not look in the monster manual if they own it. Because like you could read the monster manual and maybe understand some systems and things that they can do. But what I like to do is I read the lore on the creature, uh, the a Spoon Man. Yo, Spoon Man was great. Oh, am I not loud enough? Sorry. But
Don't worry, I'm
basically,
tweaking your audio.
okay, cool. But basically, like for example, I ran an Etin, and Ettins are known for like this. So it's a two-headed ogre, right? So what I did to make it more interesting was I read about how like when one head is awake, the other head is asleep. And so the most simplest thing that the actual monster manual says is that like, oh, one uses an axe, one uses a mace. So you're dealing with two like fighting type classes. So I decided because there's like two like to make it more dynamic and interesting because there's one head that's awake and one that's asleep. I decided to make one become a spellcaster. So every couple rounds, when one head would fall asleep and the other would awaken, the boss's fighting style would completely change.
That, having never dealt with an Etten as a player before, that terrifies me.
Especially because it was a wild magic sorcerer.
Oh no! Why would you?
But that the
So basically, the changing things up on your players is fantastic, and I'll tell you, I love taking the norm and flipping it on its head, changing it so it's non-traditional. Like I talked about this earlier with excuse me. I talked about this earlier about changing up creatures so that they are very much a reflection on the world around them. Why things. Excuse me. While I can sustain myself on the tears of my players, sometimes I also actually need food. Ugh. But anyways, tweaking it to bosses and changing around how they operate can honestly sometimes just be the difference between a boring, mundane boss fight and something that you will talk about for years and years and years. And sometimes sometimes when it goes well, it's just like, oh, do you remember that time we fought that Etten and it just completely went from just smashing Timmy in the head with an axe and just the next couple rounds it hit Joe in the face with a fireball. Oh, it was great.
actually the funniest thing about that was that Ettins are as giants, like they would like hunt cattle and things like that and steal from farmers.
Right.
And I had a centaur in my party.
Oh.
Which was worse for him because he literally got hunted down by the creature. Like everybody's like, no, don't kill it.
No, that sounds about right. Let's see. I have a question here. I'm currently in the process of making bosses for my own one-shot. Do any of y'all have tips on creating custom bosses? Are you asking from the perspective of just simply building the characters, or are you asking something a little bit more advanced? Like, all right, cool, I've got the base template, but how do I make them like a real boss? And while I wait for the answer to that, because I am an absolute sucker for the environment, as everyone who's been here thus far knows, half of a good boss fight, in my opinion, is the scene. Like, you gotta set the music, you gotta show them where you're dancing, and you gotta do the dance. Like, that's three parts of having an epic boss fight. Why Dark Souls has such good boss fights? 1, they're huge. 2, they're terrifying. 3, the environments are dope. Like, sure, it's relatively consistent, but if you're fighting a knight on the top of a crumbling bastion, or you're fighting as a giant beast on a wall, you're suddenly going, oh crap, I don't have this much space. You're thinking, you're engaged, you're automatically going, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. I can't move around all this space. That thing is as wide as where I I can't go anywhere. It is as wide as our arena. It is coming at me. It does not like me. It looks like it's fueled by hate and my tears. I don't want it. But
sorry.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and on top of that, the other thing that I love about Dark Souls bosses is that they're not just a big crazy meat bag to just hit. they're also like based in the lore of the game. But
Exactly.
but it's also behind a lot of like item descriptions and character and like NPC dialogue and stuff like that. That the character, like the monster, this big monster you fight is so engaging, and then the whole area around it, like you were saying, Holden, like the arena that you're in, like tells the story that the boss is also telling, that the items around the area are telling too.
Exactly. And that's what I was talking about. Dark Souls does fantastic static bosses because when you're there, they are there and they have an important purpose, be it for lore, be it for players. Like they are really well placed, well done static bosses. Now I see the response here. Simply the building process. I have read some of the monster manual and the DMG. I have an idea that I'd like to do, but I'd like some tips from people who've actually done it before. All right. First set of advice. Fuck the advice. Second bit of advice. build to fit the world. If these characters are super OP badasses, they're gonna be OP badasses. Does that mean that a player's gonna learn right quick if they decide to pick a fight with the wrong person? They're gonna get their ass kicked? Yeah, but that's the point. But also just one thing I will recommend on the other side of that. Don't make them so OP that your players go, well, why aren't they doing it? Like, you have to remember, your players are still your heroes of sort. They're still the main motivator of your plot. They are the reason that things progress. And if you give them, people who are NPCs around them that are infinitely more capable and have better resources and don't have a reason why they haven't solved the problem, they don't bite into it. They're not really as interested. I believe that was Sif is the name of the wolf you're looking
yeah.
for. And
I was trying to figure it out too in my head.
yeah. And Ornstein and Smoke, no, fuck
dude,
that fight.
I did a Ornstein and Smoke concept with my players once, but I did a hellhound and a goblin, and the goblin was riding the hellhound, and like they didn't know this, but whoever they killed, whichever creature they killed first, would cause the other one to get radically like buffed.
Yeah, that was the basic mechanic of the Ornstein and Smile fight as well. Which
so good.
Again, you can integrate fantastic mechanics into your boss fights. Change the environment. Make it so that they have to interact with and change the environment before they can fight the boss. Do you have to go open a couple valves to fill the room with steam to do damage? And you're not really fighting the boss directly, but just dealing with attacks and like environment changes. Does this boss cause? Are they so big they live in a cavern? So are they just so big that they cause stalagmites to fall from the roof that you have to dodge around? One thing that I love to do. Not that this will necessarily come up and be relevant in Elderbane in any way, shape, or form. By any stretch of the imagination, are dragons. Now, in lore, dragons are the closest thing to demigods as you're gonna get. These are dragons, not the fucking wyverns from Skyrim, which were basically angry lizards. These are dragons, ancient, powerful beings. And so when I was building these, for D&D a while back, I built them with this mechanic where in most video games these days it's called telegraphing. These are behaviors that game developers will give bosses or other things you have to interact with, tells that will tell the player, oh hey, they're about to do something. You see the warrior start to wind up. That's a telegraph that he's going to try and swing at you. So you, of course, what do? You block. These dragons, these bosses, are appropriately powerful. They have the means to simply erase people. Like, it doesn't matter how much health you have. It will go through your health. It'll go through and destroy your armor. It will go and disintegrate your weapons. Like, If you get caught in the wrong place, you're gone, because you've just been incinerated by, this giant cone of flame.
Mm-hmm.
But these are telegraphed ahead so that the players know, oh, hey, something's about to happen. I need to do X. And you can train them on what they're going to need to do by basically utilizing the environment, or utilizing the environment or other aspects of that environment to give them the information, like hiding behind these stone pillars, or wearing a certain kind of armor, things like that. Like you can provide this information and make it so your boss battles aren't simply, all right, we all stand around it in a bully circle and hope we roll high enough to actually hit it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that works for some things. Like if you just want to bully a boss that's been a pain in your ass, and you just want to basically kick it into the curb while it's down, go for it. Absolutely. But other cases, that doesn't work, and that's really boring.
Mm-hmm. I actually like ran into a situation, and this was when I was like earlier DMing, where I made a boss that basically was able to cast like a bunch of spells at the same time, and literally my players like mollywopped it, like completely destroyed the boss so quick. Mm-hmm. And I had to learn very quickly, because I had like two min-maxers and like a guy and like two people that were like obsessed with combat but didn't really care about min-maxing. So anytime a combat came up, it was like, we need to just wreck this thing. Mm-hmm. So me, like in my personal experience, I had to learn very quickly how to make bosses like not follow the base formula. Mm-hmm. Like something that 5e has a very I wouldn't say it's an issue, because it's not a bad thing, but one of the biggest things about 5e specifically, which is the version I play, mm-hmm. Is that the action economy is like gives a crazy advantage to either side. So the more enemies you have on one side versus the players, they have more of an advantage, and vice versa. So the difficult thing about bosses is having one boss with like 5 or 6 players that are just gonna do, as Holden said, the bully circle, and just smush it till it's dead. So, like with a boss, adding extra mechanics to it that make it more interesting. And I actually encourage that if you are gonna add interesting things to it, to try to make sure it also connects to your boss's overarching the lore to your boss.
Always.
Yeah. Sorry.
No.
Go ahead.
As you're saying, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say like legendary actions, giving them multiple reactions that aren't based in just the simple monster manual and PHB. Not saying that those things are bad. Just saying that it's just like you want to give your bosses an extra oomph by allowing them to do extra things.
Absolutely. I think, to me personally, every aspect of a boss that you customize is like it's painting another stroke onto their image. Mm-hmm. Their abilities play very heavily into who they are as a person. A lot of these are... I'm sorry, I guess I read a question. The question is, how would you integrate environmental dangers into a boss fight? I'm currently planning a sort of mini-boss for my players on an underground lake that has been frozen over. So I've considered a mechanic of possibly sliding on the ice in new players, but I want to keep the fight interesting and different than normal combat. Well, my thoughts are pretty on that immediately. Oh, well, you can fall through the ice. You could fall through the ice. You'll have to, make an athletics check to get out by yourself. You can have your players try and help other people out of the water. And if you fall in, maybe you'll have a disadvantage on dealing with attacks that are related to the cold, because you're already soaking wet because you fell into this ice lake. Maybe a disadvantage on dexterity checks to, not fall prone. There are simple things like that. if you're looking for just straight damage, I'll tell you this: there are a few exceptions where just straight damage. There are a few exceptions to this, but more often than not, you'll find that just straight damage is more frustrating than it is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like if they fall into the ice and you start having them take damage, it's gonna become less of them fighting a boss and more just like struggling with this, like with the environment, and it becomes more of like two fights at once.
Yeah,
which becomes frustrating. That's my thought, though.
Now, what I will say is, it's worse if the boss can also be affected by the environment. That leads to some very creative fighting from your players.
Mm-hmm.
If the boss is immune to its environment, on the other hand, it takes a couple edges off, but at the same time, it kind of makes sense. You're not going to find a beast in a lair that it doesn't have its own advantages in. You're fighting it in its best environment. For an example, this kind of is a way to integrate a couple things of what I was talking about for creature and combat encounters, with environment, with learning, and these sorts of things. When I was running a campaign for one of my other groups in Elderbane, when they were traveling, they ran into an encounter with wolves, these dire wolves. But one thing that was also included in this map, they had to pass a couple perception checks. When they arrived into the area, they saw a couple dead animals that were just kind of surrounding certain points, and some of them were in various states of emaciation and decay, and the wolves were also nearby because of these bodies. But when some of them passed their perception check, they spotted these sort of these flowers that were hanging up overhead that basically cast a basically they had this AoE ability that if you failed a Constitution check, you would fall asleep. And so what this creature does in its environment, it draws creatures in to its AoE, and then it puts them to sleep. And then it just starts to absorb. That's how it absorbs its nutrients. It tethers into these creatures and starts drawing the life out of them. So the players now they're now in this environment, and they see, oh, hey, there are some weird flowers here, and there's a ring of dead animals beneath it. Maybe I shouldn't stay there. But the wolves, these are human beings. They are conscious enough to see this. But what happened was, when the wolves got involved, one or two of them went into the circles and fell asleep. The other ones are intelligent enough to spot that, and they stayed out of the circles. So then the party basically started fighting the wolves and trying to get them into these circles to either just kill them, or to make them no longer a problem. So utilizing your environment in a broad spectrum of ways. It doesn't necessarily have to just be against your players. It can be against other NPCs. Hell, a boss damaging itself is really cool, because that implies, oh, hey, this thing is not, immune to its own behaviors. This is a living, breathing entity that is real. Oh, so if I get this thing to, charge at me and run head first into this canister of explosives, like, yeah, I might get hit, but that's going to be hilarious. And, you may die, but that would be an awesome story. Mm-hmm. Who knows? It's about utilizing these things. And when you can do it for a boss, that is fantastic. I'm rambling. I'm sorry. I just...
No, it's good. I'm excited.
Utilizing your native environment to tell stories and create a level of realism especially for bosses. These are the big bads. These guys have been around kicking ass for a long time compared to everybody else. And they are just as fallible as you are. And then, I don't know what it is, but when you click it into your players' heads that, oh wait, these guys also make mistakes. They're not perfect. Mm-hmm. This isn't just the DM doing things. Oh. Maybe I can get them to do things too.
And I think that's also what takes D&D different from video games, because a video game, like, the bosses that you fight, and even Dark Souls, are programmed a certain way.
Yeah.
Maybe you could find a glitch or two, but they're programmed to have certain patterns, attack patterns, movement patterns, all that. In Dungeons and Dragons, as a DM, you're trying to portray realism. And so with a boss that may do things that hurt itself, that is detrimental to its own position, it makes it become more alive. Yes, and exactly. It makes the game, it brings more of a realism into it.
I absolutely agree, Naven. Absolutely. I don't think I could have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Let's see. I believe I talked to you about this in some of this encounter previously. Blah blah blah. Okay. I'm always happy to help. That's why we run the DM's Lounge, which, again, that's going to be recurring bi-weekly on opposing weeks to the Chronicles of the Chaotic D&D. I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to have more guest speakers on to talk about a variety of different topics, just so it's not just me sitting here for damn near 2 hours talking about things. Get some extra personalities and content and perspectives, because, again, the one thing about D&D is there is never one way to play D&D. I'm telling you about mine. I'm also going to reference other people like Matt Colville, for example, and Z Bashaw.
Z Bashu?
Yeah, him. That's the gentleman's name. That is who I was talking recently about his social encounters mechanical ruling, because the PHB does a terrible job at experiencing that. The suggestion that I have players come in and, like, some of my players, or some, like, just players from some of my games or other games, or
I can tell based on what he's commenting that Breacher89 is one of my players.
Yes, Breacher is one of yours.
We have invaded.
That's fine. I'm more than happy to, just make sure while you're here, you follow. While you're here, absolutely. Let's see. People dude. You are familiar with and have played for, maybe even GM for. Yeah, sure, absolutely. I can work with that. I'd love to have more people involved in this. Let's see, the next one. So on the topic of bosses, what are your thoughts about running a secondary kind of sub-boss who's not a big bad, but still a recurring character? So you mean mini-bosses and lieutenants? Yes, those are fantastic, and we love them very much.
I'm just going to interrupt real quick. The only thing I'd say about recurring characters that you want to be careful with is that your players want to, like, if the reoccurring character is not strong enough to avoid the players when they need to escape or whatever, then it won't become a recurring character, because the moment your players get the chance to, if it's a character that's just like a thorn in their side, they will instantly murder them, and you'll no longer have a reoccurring character.
Yeah, your mileage may vary with that, but yeah, definitely. I can agree with that on personal experience, because it feels tacky when you have to Deus Ex Machina somebody back to life because plot. If it escapes, I'm going to be pissed. The autocorrect reveals your truth.
Oh no.
But yeah, absolutely, it's fantastic. Running lieutenants and mini bosses are great, especially if found the bard. Kisses for the homies.
Always gotta kiss the homies goodnight.
But working with, I'll use an example here, just because it is coming up with the players themselves. Recently, they have run into a lieutenant for it was a. Oh shoot! I can't believe I'm blanking on the names. Mini bosses and recurring characters are fine. They don't necessarily always need to come up in They it doesn't have to die. It could be considered. Jesus. They don't all need to be combat encounters. You can deal with fantastic villains they're going to beat you in social encounters. When it comes to political runs and political campaigns, the best form of mini bosses and villains are people who disagree with you. Like, I know that sounds very simplistic compared to he's like a level 16 barbarian wizard hybrid with like 6 extra subclasses. That was probably closer to a boss, but that's beside the point.
But you're saying like more like characters that oppose the players that aren't necessarily evil.
Yeah, like you can write that's such a broad spectrum of like villains, but so for brevity and for the sake of this example, we're running a political campaign. And you're representing faction A, and someone else that you don't like necessarily, or that you do like, is representing faction B. Your goal is to get faction A and faction B to work together, but they don't. So your villain in this circumstance, the person who is representing alternative interests that are counter to yours, you don't even have to dislike them. Like, you could be genuinely good friends and disagree out on some critical and core values in most cases. And I'm not going to get into all the present political nuance of what that implies. But mini bosses in this case don't necessarily need to be... Hell, they don't even need to be people in some cases. But, hold on. There's an up and coming, and then, okay... Okay. Well, that is definitely something that can be done. I would recommend, if you want some live feedback, being very careful. Because most players... There are 2 kinds of players. For the sake of this example, there are 2 kinds of players. The ones that will go, this is a youngling necromancer. Kill it before it gets stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And then, this is a youngling. This is a youngling necromancer. Let's recruit him, and that way, when he's more powerful, we can use his abilities. Those are your options.
And like I was saying earlier about making sure that your reoccurring characters or sub bosses have a contingency plan, or like, because if they hear of an up and coming necromancer, like Hilton was saying, they're going to want to stomp it out or recruit it. And what's going to happen is that, like, if you don't want that necromancer to join them, but you also don't want him to die in 10 seconds, then you need to have him have enough, I guess, levels or enough things. Not levels in the sense of stages, but levels in the sense of like parts of story or parts of the world that's like protecting him from the players instantly mollywopping him, because that's what they will do.
Yeah, absolutely. Like
if he's hidden somewhere, or they hear NPCs talking about, there's this crazy necromancer doing stuff, and then the players go there and he's not there, but they get information as to his whereabouts, and you slowly build up a lot of like mystery. I think that's the route I would go if you want to keep this
If
sub villain becoming a bigger issue later. Then it would need to be like rumor. You would have to have. I think you would have to set up like rumors and stuff.
if you want them to live, they can never be in the same place at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least they can, they can never be in the hell. They could be in the same building, they just can't physically be in the same place at the same time. Because once you get them in a line of sight where they can throw a fireball, they're going to do it.
Or you have them behind a prismatic wall, ninth level abjuration spell.
Yeah, no, I mean, you could do that,
but like, and that's me more explaining like the over protection you would have to put on that character.
Yeah, you could definitely do that. You don't always necessarily have to go like, oh, well, there's a ninth level abjuration, because if you have a wizard, you go, I see. There's a problem here. Counterspell, and then it's done. Mm-hmm. Or dispel, which is even lower, magic. Which is even lower level. So, like, especially if this necromancer has done anything to, God forbid, vaguely annoy your party at any point in time. We all know that NPCs are one bad dialogue away from getting murder hoboed. Like, they are one bad conversation away from winding up dead in a back alley. So doing it with characters that you want to have longevity when it comes to dealing with your players, if they're the kind of players who will go and like, oh, all right, I'm just going to sit here and role play and figure out, oh, do I really want to, like, where's this story going to go? What's this kind of interaction? That's golden. That's fantastic. However, most of us are not that fortunate, and most of us go, ooh, necromancer, it must die, or necromancer, I want it, or necromancer, I want it. Oh, they disagreed with me, so now they must die.
Mm-hmm. Especially with a keyword like necromancer. If it was like a transmuter or something that was less like, or just like when you hear necromancer, you think evil right away.
It has the connotation attached.
It's that connotation, exactly. Yeah. So like you can play a good necromancer, I believe at least, but it's a looked at as an evil kind of magic, and so they hear that they're going to want to do option A or B, as Holden had said.
Yeah, and I mean, if you even like, I don't know any of the details about this character's personality, but literally having the conversation and having them like, hey, no, I'm not going to drop any spoilers for Curse of Strahd, but there are ways to do that where you can drop your players into the same area with them and provide completely different context to the circumstance. Like if they just walk up and kick this dude's door in and go, "Sup, bitch, I'm here for my money," you're gonna have you're gonna have a very like dead necromancer on your hands.
They're gonna get their money.
Yeah, exactly. Or they're gonna die. Like that's most people who are just like that. It's like, well, I'm committed to this, whether it goes well or not. And that's how you get TPKs and sad story times where you're like, well, I wanted to tell you this cool story, but I can't because you're dead. And I know all of you are good players, but you're going to remember it in your next life, and he's going to die. So no.
So I have a specific example that comes to mind in one of my games. I had this NPC named Spoonman, and he was basically like, he did a lot of like teleportation and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. He would open up portals all over the place. Mm-hmm. And his whole thing was that he dressed up in like a full like spandex suit and believed he was a superhero. Mm-hmm. And so when the party first met him, he was against them and wanted to they wanted to basically kill him, especially because his portals were really, really annoying. And then as they continued fighting him and found out a little bit about who he was as he talked to them during the fight, and which by the way, that's a super important thing, like making sure that your NPC villains, especially if you want them to be reoccurring, or if you want for like what I kind of wanted to happen, which did, like have them aid the party, there has to be a lot of role playing done inside of the combat. Because if it's just a thing that's standing in front of them using spells and hitting them, the party's not going to question anything. They're going to want to murder it right away.
Exactly.
So 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 having sorry, I'm going to mention about what you just said, but I want to finish real quick. So what I ended up doing was having him kind of like during the fight kind of like explaining and trying to figure out why he had to fight them, and then eventually they became friends and they ended up having an ally who helped teleport them some places. But it was near the end of the campaign, right before we finished. So, like, for a recurring character, like, if this necromancer is a character you're really excited about, right, and you want him to be like, if you want him to be like super bad and with no chance of switching sides, you could even, this is another thought I had, you could even have it that he is nice until what he wants, until what the party wants and what he wants don't align anymore. If you want the necromancer to be around enough. But I think this your smartest plan of action, if you want this NPC to constantly to slowly grow as a villain, then they should not be in the same room, like Holden was saying.
Yeah, no, that is very much correct. Interesting villains are the ones that are interacted with, not the ones you throw your numbers against.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm just going to make the reference here. Strahd von Zarovich, one of the best written villains ever. Regularly interacts with the players. Sometimes it's a very cordial conversation. Sometimes it's letters. Sometimes he's over there trying to tear your face off. It all depends on what the players have been up to. And it's just, when you define and develop these characters through their interactions with the players and the lore, you can get some really, really unique and invested players. For when I was playing through Curse of Strahd, I was playing Barda. It was a Bard of Lore. He was the happiest, most innocent guy who decided to adventure simply for the sole purpose of having more stories to tell the village kids. And then, unfortunately, his first adventure was in Barovia, and he'd been nothing but traumatized and angry and upset and sad for the next several days he was there. So much to the point that at one point in time, he literally threw Strahd off his horse. And it ended an entire encounter because Strahd was just like, this peasant touched me. I don't enjoy this anymore. And so, I still remember it because this character had invested with another NPC that was involved in the story. My character had developed a sort of a faux crush on this NPC, simply because I thought it was interesting. That NPC got threatened by Strahd, and so this whole time, Barda had basically been like, I don't really do a whole lot of fighting. I usually play a support. I heal people. And then this small, not necessarily very strong bard flies out of nowhere, and I mean fly literally as in the flying spell, and tackles Strahd off of his, flying tackles him off of his horse. It was the most, as a player, I was up out of my seat. It's just like, yeah! It was a great time! Fuck yeah! Yeah! I was absolutely hyped for it because, one, I thoroughly enjoyed, interacting with Strahd as a villain, and I had the fortune of having a very good GM for that off to the side here who, A, isn't paying attention, and B, never mind, he is, had done a fantastic job for that story. But when you are able to get your players invested, and it doesn't even need to be your big bad, having them interact with your NPCs in a way that they go, yeah, I like these people, or fuck that guy. That's really the crux of it, because the players' decisions on how they want to handle it. We had one person in our party who actively wanted to sell us out to Strahd, and the rest of us wanted to go, no, fuck that guy. It's that's the bread and butter of what we do. That's what makes it. I don't have any extra words for it. That's just that is what we do. That's the goal. Like that's it. That's it. Like as Breacher said, role play is key for fun villains. Absolutely, I agree. It doesn't matter how many mechanics you throw in. It doesn't matter how many like special custom abilities. If you're throwing your players at the equivalent of a piece of paper, they're gonna treat it like it's a piece of paper. But when you throw them at a person, this person has motivations. This person has reason to interact with them. If these people have history, that's why backstories with players with history, oh, it's so much fun because oh yeah, you didn't know this, but you definitely had an uncle who doesn't like you for whatever reason. That's plot now.
If what can make your bosses even more interesting is actually reading through your players' backstories and finding like one key element, because usually most players add a little bit of have at least a little bit of tragedy to their backstory, and using some of that tragedy to kind of create a more dynamic boss that had some involvement in it, excuse me, will also make that more exciting.
Absolutely.
And more engaging, especially if you throw in the role playing.
I can't agree more. And so some people when they're like, oh well, I don't really want to give you a backstory, those are the best, because they best give you open canvas to do whatever the hell you want. And then when they get upset, it's like, oh well, that doesn't make any sense. It's like, well, you need to give me a backstory or I'm going to do this. Don't make a habit out of doing that. That's punitive to your players' choices. And
yeah.
You
also have to have a player that can work with that, because some players don't know how.
Yeah.
And it's a learning thing. You know what I mean? It's not that they're doing anything wrong, but like some players don't know how to like bounce off or improv some aspects of those things. So sometimes throwing, like, knowing your player and knowing what you can and can't throw at them. Like, I have a player, and he's great. He remembers everything his character can do, mostly. But like some role-playing aspects he feels uncomfortable with, and we've talked about it and stuff like that. So I know not to throw the most emotional thing ever at him, because he's going to be like, duh.
I am not emotionally equipped to deal with this in person or in game. Okay, well, it's about that time, ladies and gentlemen. We're getting close to wrapping it up for the evening. I do want to thank everybody so much for being here, especially my guest, Naven. Thank you again so much. I know it was kind of last minute. I know you've been very busy lately, but I'm glad. I did want to have you on here. You know, I picked Encounter specifically because I wanted to have an opportunity for you on here. So that worked out well. Otherwise, I was literally going to have to improvise for 2 hours, and that would have been bad. Thank you so much, everyone who showed up, not just from my immediate group, but also Naven's group. I hope you guys come back again soon. We run the DM Lounge every other week, on alternating weeks from the Chronicles of the Chaotic D&D sessions. Those all run from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Everything's on a bi-weekly schedule, so don't worry. It's usually late enough in the evening that most people are mostly settled in for the night either way. While you're here, please make sure to follow. I'm not big for plugging anything, but it really does help the channel, and it helps us all, keep progress and making sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. I still don't know how to take compliments on the spot, but I appreciate that.
Listen. I wish I had your voice for when I'm trying to roleplay stuff, because everything sounds like a squawking, I don't know, like a squawking parrot.
No,
everything.
You know what? We'll do another session here soon. That's just about, all right, how to DM if you're shit at voices. And I'm not even. It's not like, oh, I'm so great at it. Blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. I'm fucking terrible. I have deep voice, regular voice, and slightly escalated voice. That's all I got. That's it. Um, thanks very much for the help.
That needs to be on a t-shirt.
Take the advice and fuck it, as Holden suggested. God. But yeah, while you're here, please make sure to subscribe, follow if follow and subscribe if you'd be so interested. It really does help us maintain progress on the channel and help us, go up in the ratings. Over time, things will be improving. We'll be getting better cameras. Right now, it's not a high budget production by any stretch of the imagination, as you can see by the fact that you haven't been able to read literally anything on my desk at all this entire time.
I see Donator at the top.
Okay, fair. I mostly meant this, the content
I know.
night.
I'm just instigating. Sorry, it's my superpower.
That's true. Switchar is out of order. And again, if you missed it tonight, it's gonna be. Yeah, it's my desk. All of our streams are, they get recorded here on Twitch for 14 days, and then everything also gets uploaded to the YouTube channel, The Chronicles of Chaos. So feel free to go there and subscribe to the channel as well. You'll get all the updates for whenever we do new updates and uploads. Usually it's pretty much immediately after our sessions here. So with that, again, thank you everyone so much for coming. I really do appreciate you guys being here, sticking around.
I know who that is.
He's all right,
Hi, wife.
Second part found.
Second part found. Oh my gosh.
Thank you so much, everyone. I do really appreciate you all being here, and I look forward to seeing you all next week when we start streaming the second episode of the Chronicles of the Chaotic Season 3. So, have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you. Stay safe.